Hello, everyone. As you can see, I have something of a new model. I'm showcasing this here because this is one of my best stories, and I've been hoping to remaster it properly for some time now. This is the first part of a trilogy I'm writing, and I hope to form it into a complete novel. I hope you all enjoy this, and I welcome you to a barren world. The old man stared at me from across the chessboard. His eyes were dull and glassy, and he pondered his next move with great intent. I made no attempt to move, prolonging my own turn as much as possible. We had money riding on this game, a gamble which I rarely participated in. I'm horrible at chess, to the point that flipping the board would be the closest I could come to properly winning the game. The real victory would come from learning where this gentleman kept his wallet. When he had reached for his coat pocket, I was elated. Those were always the easiest to pick, and the man appeared to be dozing off. I felt a twinge of remorse which quickly faded. From the fine suit under his coat, this was obviously some sort of businessman who exploited the less fortunate on a daily basis. He grew rich and fat off of innocent people's suffering, and he would show no mercy to me if I were underneath him. Why should I be any better, Besides, he undoubtedly had much more money than just what he was carrying on him. A little donation wouldn't hurt him at all. He was under my heel, and I could crush him like an insect. But I wouldn't ruin him. Action begets reaction, of course, but I would keep myself from going too far. I was simply relieving him of some wealth. I knew it must be such a burden to have pockets that heavy, and I'm happy to lighten the load whenever someone's feeling a little too weighed down. At least that's what I told myself. The self-righteousness spared what was left of my conscience, but the truth was much simpler. I needed this. If I didn't steal, I would starve. He was entirely asleep now, his head resting on the table and gently pushing many of the pieces out of place. I looked around and saw that no one was watching. Trying not to move much, I reached a hand up under the table and into his coat pocket. I clasped the thick leather wallet in my fingers. I drew my arm back, sliding it out ever so gently. A rough hand grabbed my wrist. He pulled me in closer and leaned forward, grinning smugly. "Gotcha, son." I smiled back pleasantly and picked up my cane, gently pressing the tip into a very sensitive spot. "If you would be so kind as to release my hand, good sir," I replied. "I don't want to get any blood on my coat." He gasped and his grip loosened. I ripped my arm away and tucked the wallet into my breast pocket. The man shouted at me as I ran, but I didn't care. I simply needed the money. With this man having paid the bill, I could survive for weeks. However, the real prize could make all this irrelevant. If I was lucky, I wouldn't have to steal again this year. It was all I could think of. George Willis was a very wealthy man. He had discovered oil out west and retired early. His son, Carson, ran the business out there, and George would sit and get wealthier by the minute. 2 weeks ago he vanished. His wife, his daughter, even the maid had followed suit. The police said there was no trace. With the only heir living out west, no one had arrived to claim any of the late Willis's belongings. I, of course, would be more than willing to step in and help those poor souls. Still, I couldn't do something of this magnitude alone. I needed a partner, someone big and strong to help me with the gathering of precious items in the house. Ben was the perfect candidate, a factory worker scraping by on pennies. He was as strong as an ox, and desperate enough to set his strong morals aside once in a while. As I strode up to the Willis house, I could see him waiting on the stairs. He greeted me as I walked up, and I waved him off. Tonight was far too important for such formalities. "Did you bring a weapon?" I asked as I approached. He pulled back his coat to reveal a small pistol tucked into his belt. I slid my cane's sheath back, revealing the thin blade within. "You any good with that thing?" Ben inquired, the sarcasm clear even through his gravelly voice. I laughed along, then replied, "Well, I'm no master fencer, but I can keep the street rats off my back. It's fast enough to keep up with small blades, and long enough to give me the advantage. I even fought my way past 5 armed men once. Been a bit uneasy in alleys ever since. I'm sure you understand." I strode over to the lock and examined it. I pulled out a small case, selected the appropriate tool, and the door to my future was open in less than a minute. The smell of rot hit us as soon as I opened the door. It reminded me of mold, of meat left to spoil, and there was a faint sulphuric odor as well. The house, however, was in fair condition. The living room was pristine, with chairs arranged around a table. A tea set was on that table, glittering in the dim light. The wallpaper was a dull purple, and the drapes a vibrant blue. The whole thing seemed exaggerated and plain at the same time. I began to feel even happier that Willis was gone. The tea set looked to be silver, but there was surely something of greater value than that here. "Perhaps down the hall," I suggested, praying to every god I could remember that we'd find something better. Down the hall was the kitchen. The smell was much worse here, and I could see why. On the table was a grand feast, set out for the entire family. Not a single bite had been taken out of it, though. Being left to rot, mold was growing all over. The roast chicken had the coarse, wrinkled skin of an old man, with an oily outer layer to cover it. Vegetables dissolved into fluid, with small pieces floating around on the plates. A cake was set out, with a white frosting that I believed to be entirely made up of mold. A loud crash came from upstairs, followed by a man shouting in a harsh foreign tongue. A woman shouted back in the same language. I tried to recognize it, but the phrases were First slip of a second slip up of the day. Woohoo. 3, 2, 1. A woman shouted back in the same language. I tried to recognize it, but the phrases were unlike any human dialect. Ben gasped, but I covered his mouth with my hand. I took his arm and pulled him down to the floor. We crawled under the dining table and pulled the tablecloth over ourselves. Loud footsteps came from above, and I could hear them drawing ever closer. I peeked out from under the tablecloth and nearly screamed. Standing in the hallway was a man, clad entirely in medieval armor which looked as if it were carved from black stone. The suit seemed to cover his entire body, aside from a slit for his eyes. He stood higher than any man, and he seemed far more muscular, too. His hand clutched a staff with a bladed tip. I ducked back under the table, hoping that he didn't see me. A loud crack echoed through the room, and the vile banquet slid down between Ben and I. I leapt to my feet, and Ben crawled away. The warrior swung at me, and I jumped back. Ben drew his gun and fired 2 rounds at him, but the bullets bounced off of the stone plates. Upon seeing this, he dropped the gun and backed away. I ducked another swing from the blade and ran to the hallway. I took hold of my cane with both hands and unsheathed the sword within. The warrior swung again, and I stepped back, then lunged, aiming the sword with surgical precision. The blade slid directly into the warrior's visor. He collapsed and fell over. The woman called from upstairs. 3, 2, 1. The woman called down from upstairs, and I took a deep breath, then ran up to greet her. I looked up and down the hall, then saw an open door and ran inside. The woman stood there, clad in the same dark armor and bearing the same terrifying weapon. This time I didn't hesitate. I ran at her, sword raised. She swept the massive staff at me, and I ducked. The weapon smashed into the wall, destroying a large piece. I shuddered to think what it could do to my insides. She turned and kicked me in the chest, then dislodged her staff from the wall. The warrior pointed the blade of her weapon at me and raised it to strike. Ben ran up from behind us and slammed the other man's weapon through her visor. She crumpled, and Ben sighed with relief. I removed her helmet and gasped in shock. Her visage was unnaturally gaunt, and her skin was as gray as ash. The blade had ruined one eye, but the other was black and oily. I ran my finger down her cheek, and her skin was coated in a powdery substance. "Who are these people?" Ben asked. I thought for a moment, then replied, "Look around. Willis might have left us some clues as to what madness has engulfed this place." We searched, and Ben soon found a locked safe. I picked that lock and drew it open. Inside was a note and a parcel. I took the parcel and unwrapped it. It was a large dagger, wrought of black stone. A white gem was embedded in the hilt. The blade was flawless, as if it had never been used. I tucked it into my belt, then turned my attention to the note. I picked it up and felt a rush of anticipation as I unfolded it. I began to read it aloud. "Bearer of this note, by whatever means you are reading this, you have opened a door, and the thing on the doorstep has already seen you. You have a chance to escape by putting down this note and running as far away as you can. However, this peril is far more extensive than you know, and it threatens many more lives should you choose to run. If you are still reading this, then know that I will most likely be dead, and you need to understand why, or join me in my fate." I had heard strange noises coming from my basement for some time before, and I had decided to dig into the walls to look for rats or other vermin. I had only dug a few feet deep before I had located a massive subterranean chamber. I discovered that this was a complex of tunnels carved by some ancient civilization which seemed now 3, 2, 1. I discovered that this was a complex of tunnels carved by some ancient civilization which seems now to be extinct. I stumbled across a large chamber with a black dagger embedded in the ground. This weapon seemed magnificent and would look quite nice in my house. I pulled it from the ground and took it back with me. This must have been what conjured those things. When I next went into those tunnels, I came into the large chamber and saw that a man was patrolling the hall. He saw me and chased me through the tunnel for some time. I managed to lose him then, but he found his way up to my home and brought another of his kind. I watched as they cut down my wife and tore my daughter to shreds. I barricaded myself in this room, but they will get through soon. When I tried to shoot them, the bullets were ineffective. These two are quite strong, but I don't believe they are alone. The civilization below was silent, but perhaps I woke them, and now it seems they can break through to our world. The rift in between our worlds has been ripped open, and there is no return. There is only one way to ensure our safety now. Travel through whatever rift they do, and eliminate any threat from the other side. Do this, or I do not believe our world shall survive. I have also encased in the false back of this safe $10,000. If you succeed in saving this world, I implore you to purchase my home from whoever may inherit the deed, and live on in this place to ensure that no one else can learn what I have and jeopardize us once more." Ben sat against the wall. "Well then," he said, a pitiable tone in his shaking voice. "We need to tell the police. They'll keep us safe. I drew my sword and pointed it at him. He stopped, and his eyes grew wide. He opened his mouth to speak, but I cut him off. "The police will do nothing but lock us away. We broke into this house and killed 2 people. I alone have done much more, and I'd barely even have a trial before spending the rest of my life in a cell. You are almost nobody, and would be dismissed as such, potentially to face the horrors of a madhouse. Aside from this note and the corpses on the floor, the police have no reason to believe us. They would do nothing. And think of the bigger picture. The Great War has been raging for 4 years, with no end in sight. All of this world's great armies have been weakened considerably due to this. As of now, a small force of these soldiers could take this world by storm. We are the only people who know, who have seen these monsters with our own eyes. We are the ones who must stand against this menace. Now I am going to take this dagger and do what I can to stop this madness. Will you join me? Or shall I save you some time and run you through here and now?" Ben laughed. "Come now, Mr. Smythe. You're a thief, not a murderer. These people clearly do not share your high moral standards, though, and I wouldn't like to see their plans for our world. I will come with you, if only to keep myself safe. Now let's find that rift and end this." I laughed and put my sword away, but a tear started to form in my eye, for his words had cut deeper than he could ever know. I had killed a man tonight, in my own defense. If Ben was unwilling, I should have killed him too, but he was right. As I am now, I cannot kill a man in cold blood. Deep down I knew continuing on this path meant that I would have to murder someone, and I hoped that I could do it properly then. Now was not the time, sir. 3, 2, 1. Now was not the time for such thoughts. We needed to push onward. In the basement we found the hole mentioned in Willis's note, but it had been dug out slightly to be larger than a man. Ben and I stepped through, light pouring softly from the lantern in my hand. The chamber was carved from black stone. Intricate designs were carved into the walls, indicating a very proud and artistically minded race with great attention to detail. The carving seemed almost alive, flowing with ancient energy. We pressed on into the tunnel. The brilliance of the chamber was gone, replaced now by a cheap, shoddily dug hole, barely even considerable as a tunnel. The dirt around us was compacted, or there may not have been a passage at all. The scent also became more rank as we proceeded, resembling something unlike any smell on earth. The tunnel started to open again, and we soon found ourselves in another stone chamber. I looked around, and I could see no end to the chamber on the far side. Several voices. 3, 2, 1. I called out. Several voices yelled in reply, in that inhuman language. I cursed under my breath, then remarked that some of the words seemed to resemble English more closely. The soldiers marched haughtily out of the darkness, brandishing their staves. Ben readied his own staff, but I kept my sword sheathed. As long as they thought it was a cane, I could potentially still catch one of them by surprise and make this fight a bit less overwhelming. Suddenly, one of them cried in pain and fell to the ground. A stone knife protruded from his visor. They halted, and two more fell. They scattered, emerging into the darkness and twirling their weapons. A young woman charged out. She was clad in rough cloth, with sparse pieces of stone armor attached to her rags. Her face was similar to the others, but her skin was unnaturally pale, as if sunlight had never graced it. Her hair was a shortly chopped mess. She drew two knives and leapt through the air at one of the soldiers. She tackled him and slid a blade neatly through his throat, then threw her other knife into another's visor. They circled around her, regaining their composure. She retrieved her spare blade, then paused. A soldier stepped behind her and lunged at her back. She turned, grabbed his weapon under her arm, and poked her knife through his visor, then threw him in front of her to block another strike. It was like watching a whirlwind. She stabbed two more, then latched onto the final man's weapon, forcing it out of his hands and impaling him through the visor with it. She then retrieved her knives. "Stay back," I told Ben, drawing my own sword. She broke into a run, then sprang at me. I ducked under her and flicked my blade out, slicing at her belly. I didn't cut deeply, but she was certainly bleeding. She pivoted midair, facing me as she landed. I took my blade with both hands, then braced myself as she struck. She sliced at me with blinding speed, but I deflected every blow. I followed with a slash at her hand. I didn't cut her, but I managed to knock the knife away. I spun around, kicking her in the chest. She staggered backward, and I pressed forward with a relentless assault. 3, 2, 1. I spun around, kicking her in the chest. She staggered backward, and I pressed forward with a relentless assault. The feral woman threw herself at me in desperation, and I caught her blade. We were in a deadlock for several seconds, but I then gave way and let her arm slip through, forcing her off to the side. I brought my blade around, and by the time she had recovered, it was resting on her throat. "I am Daniel Smythe," I stated, "and this is Ben. Who are you?" She stepped back. I don't quite remember. Clara seems familiar, so call me that. In any event, I've been here longer than you, and that would mean that you're trespassing in my home. Why would you be doing that?" I thought for a moment, then replied, "We are not your enemy. Quite the opposite, in fact. There is an entire world above these caverns, and through some kind of rift, these warriors have come to do great harm to its people. We are here to put a stop to this invasion." She crossed her arms. "These people are how I survive. I eat their flesh and cleanse myself in their blood. Without a steady supply of them, I wouldn't last long down here, so why should I allow this?" I gasped in horror. A knot of dread formed in my stomach as I realized the cannibalistic nature of the person before me. I quickly thought of something to appease the savage. "If we succeed, we can bring you food from above. We can bring you water to drink and bathe in. We can give you a better life. All you have to do is let us see this through." Her eyes glittered, and she lunged at me, grabbing onto my coat. I was taken by surprise, but I felt that retaliation was unnecessary by the joy that beamed from her. "Water? You have so much water you can bathe in it? I can only drink it from leaking cracks in the stone. Sometimes I can't even coax water from there, and I need to drink their blood as well. If you would be willing to bring me water, and food too, well, this is better than I could ever imagined. But before you feed me, I will feed you. Come back to my shelter and rest. I've just caught us a feast, and I'm happy to take care of you for a while, to help prepare you for your endeavor." I was shocked at her outburst of friendliness, but willing to take advantage of the situation. "Very well, we shall come with you. Ben, get one of these people out of their armor. It would seem we have a very different type of meat on our menu." "You can't be serious," Ben retorted. I walked up to him. "Look, we need to accept her hospitality. If we turn her against us, well, I got lucky this time. If she attacks us again, I might not be able to keep us alive. So, she likes us for now. Let's keep it that way." Ben nodded solemnly, his face contorted with disgust. She had led us back to her chamber, which was a small dugout at the end of a tunnel. Water leaked through cracks in the walls and soaked into the dirt floor. The back corner of the room was a large pile of dirt which served as a bed. In the other corner, a makeshift stove was set up, consisting of a small hole to burn armor padding and a breastplate which served as a stovetop. It was one of the best meals I had ever tasted. The fire dimmed and we were all sleepy. "Go on," Clara said, a loving tone in her voice. "Go and sleep. The dirt pile can keep you quite warm if you bury yourself deep enough." Ben shot up at this and looked worriedly over to me. "No, Mr. Smythe, this has been strange enough. I could barely tolerate the meal, and now you want that we should sleep next to her, and give her an opportunity to do just about anything to us while we sleep. No, I won't do it." I sighed. "Ben, if it matters that much to you, I'll stay up and you two can sleep." It was settled. The two of them tucked in on opposite sides of the pile, and I took up a guard position near the door, settling in for a long night. Clara. I opened my eyes. I was laying on a bed of soft ash. Loud crashes echoed around me. I looked up. There was no roof. Instead, it was all gray, with flashes of dim light around me. Bursts of light danced across the open roof. I began to sit up. A hand rested on my shoulder and a voice called out, "Well, I certainly hadn't expected to see you again." I began to turn, but I saw only a swirling vortex of ash, reaching up into the heavens. I woke suddenly and flailed violently, sending dirt flying everywhere. The dream felt so real. I looked over at Daniel, who sat by the fading embers. He hadn't even turned around at my outburst. I walked over to him. "Go to sleep now," I said, hoping he could still hear me. "I'll keep watch for the rest of the night." He turned around and opened his mouth, as if to debate my request. After a few seconds of silence, he crawled over to the dirt pile and collapsed. I breathed a sigh of content and sat down in the corner. Still, my heart pounded as the cacophony echoed in the silent room. Daniel. I woke to a hand on my shoulder. Clara smiled down at me and handed me a chunk of charred meat. I ate it as I looked around the room. Ben was already awake, resting by the fire pit. Clara was sharpening her knives. "Well, Ben," I began, "I do believe it's time we left." Clara stood up, knife in hand. "I can't let you do this." Ben leapt up, aiming his staff. "I knew it. We couldn't trust her then, and we can't trust her now. You should have killed her off when you had her pinned." Clara hissed, "As I was saying, I can't let you do this alone. I haven't got a life down here. I just survive off the vermin. You promised me a chance to escape this, and I intend to see that you see your end of the bargain through. Make good on it. Just don't try to decline. I'm not allowing one of them to cut you down for all my troubles." Ben accepted this and lowered his weapon. I walked over to her. "So, Clara, we are looking for some source of power, anything unnatural that you could have seen." Clara smiled. "Why, yes," she began. "I happen to know exactly what you're looking for. Your little rift just so happens to be my favorite hunting ground. It's in something of a main hall, I suppose. We'll probably have to fight our way in. There's no way around it. So do whatever you must to keep yourselves alive." We left shortly after. Clara led us through the ruins, and with her guiding us, the journey was much faster. We reached the inner sanctum in minutes. It was a large room with several warriors patrolling the grounds. In the center, the rift sat, floating above a raised altar. It wasn't particularly remarkable, but it seemed horribly wrong at the same time. The air was distorted, in the same way that the air above a flame dances with an unnatural shimmer. The soldiers stopped moving. Slowly, they all turned around to face us. I turned to face Ben. "Stay close to me now," I said, drawing my sword. They advanced, brandishing their spears. Clara threw her knives, felling 2 of them. She drew another set from behind her and charged in. I followed along, slashing and stabbing at soldiers as we ran by. They were stunned by our assault, but soon recovered and closed in on us. Ben rushed in and swung at one of them. The soldier deflected his strike, then brought his spear around and into Ben's torso. He screamed and fell over. As the soldier pulled his weapon out, I leaped over and rammed my blade through his visor. Clara finished off the last 2, and I sheathed my sword. Ben writhed in pain, and I lifted up his shirt. The spear had gone through him and out the other side. It was a clean wound, however, and seemed to miss any vital organs. I reached into my coat and pulled out a small bottle of absinthe. It was quite useful for coercing information, but it should serve well enough to clean the wound. I slowly poured it out onto him. Ben howled like a wounded animal and shook violently. Clara pinned him down, and I finished pouring it out. I took off my shirt and ripped it into strips, then bandaged him up. I fastened my coat back on, then sat down in a corner of the room. "That's all I can do," I said. "It's not too late. We can still take you back up and get you to a hospital." He scoffed. "Mr. Smythe, I've committed to this just as much as you. I will stay and I will fight, even if I must do it all with a hole in my belly." I was shocked. I knew he was strong, but to think that he would fight through this, it was simply amazing. We sat there for a few minutes, until Ben had recovered enough to move. We gathered around the break in the air, this uncanny rift. It sparkled like no gem I had ever seen before, but at the same time it seemed to devour all light that passed it. In fact, I could feel a slight breeze from air being pulled into this thing. I looked over at Ben and Clara. While it was possible that this rift could lead nowhere, it was the only way onward. I saw this truth in their eyes, and together we stepped into oblivion. Ben. We fell out of the rift, landing onto a bed of soft, reddish-gray sand. No, not sand. Ash. I looked up and was shocked by the world that surrounded me now. A wasteland stretched out before me. The land was mostly barren, with a few occasional crops of some sort of large weed. The plants were gray and looked like dead trees shorn of branches. No animals were in sight. The sky was covered in storm clouds, yet no rain fell. Lightning danced across the sky, occasionally striking the ground. The land was riddled with large chunks of some black rock. There was a single mountain off in the distance that seemed to be made entirely from this rock. The mountain's peak looked as if it had been shorn cleanly off. The entire place seemed as if it was scorched by some supernatural presence. I looked over at Mr. Smythe and Clara, and they were just as shocked as I. "What now?" I asked, seeing no signs of life.
"Obviously we'll go over to that mountain," Clara said. "Can't you see those markings? There on the side. Those clearly aren't natural, and it is likely they were made by someone. If we're looking for where those warriors came from, that's our best chance of finding them."
I still couldn't see anything, but good Mr. Smythe didn't protest, so I went along with him. A few hours later, we arrived at the base of the mountain. My wound kept me from moving quickly, but we still made it there. We stood in front of a great stone city. The entire place was carved from the black rocks. A wall of hardened ash encircled the whole place, punctuated by a stone gate. Stone houses rose up into view. A grand staircase rose up far above the rest of the city, leading to the flattened peak of the mountain. It split into two paths. One path led to a door which was carved into the side. There seemed to be an underground chamber just below the peak. The other path led up to the peak itself. Mr. Smythe shouted, and a single guard walked up to the gate.
"We have come to speak to your leader," he called. "It is a matter of great urgency. Lives are at stake."
The guard said nothing. He didn't react at all. Suddenly, Clara fell over, gasping. She twitched violently for a few seconds, then ceased.
"She wants us to come. She's waiting on the peak," Clara uttered,
a profound look of despair welling up in her eyes. Mr. Smythe knelt beside her.
"Who is she? What did she do to you?"
Clara convulsed. Foam rolled down her lips. She gagged, then vomited onto the ash.
"Don't try my patience. Get up to the peak now."
Clara's eyes rolled back, and she stopped moving. Mr. Smythe quickly put his hand near her face. "She's still breathing. Whatever happens, she'll live. Let's wait a moment longer. Give her a chance to come to. I don't want to go against this mysterious voice, but it'll be much easier if we aren't dragging her up those stairs." Clara sat up, panting heavily.
"What happened?"
she inquired. I was too surprised to respond. Mr. Smythe stammered for the first time since I had met him. We need to get to the peak." The stone door opened wide. "Daniel." We strode through the gate into the city. It was barren, with only a few soldiers. The massive stone buildings loomed overhead. A small battalion approached us. I motioned for Ben and Clara to hide, and we ducked behind a building. I peeked around the corner, watching them come closer. Suddenly the ground began to shift. The ash around the soldiers, it began to move, and a group of assassins in gray cloaks stood up. They carried stilettos and spears with large blades jutting out to the side like winged lugs. They leapt at the soldiers and struck with the precision and grace of trained dancers. They would turn away the stone warriors' strikes with their spears, then finish them with a stiletto to the eyes or throat. It was beautiful and terrifying at the same time. They tore through the soldiers in seconds. One of them barked a command. They raced toward the wall, as if they were trying to break through it. At the last moment, they jumped up, kicking outwards. Spikes on their boots became visible, and they dug into the side of the wall. They ran up the side, taking the watchman with them. They reached the top, then threw him into the air back to our side. His neck was broken, lying at a strange angle. The assassins began to climb down the other side. One of them stopped and gazed at me. I stayed quiet, trying to stifle a cry of fear. The assassin turned away and climbed down the wall. We ran over to the stairs and up the mountain, and began to climb. As we reached the top of the stairs, the lightning seemed to intensify. We climbed to the summit and looked around. The mountain peak was flat and clean. The desolation atop this mountain had been converted into a sort of throne room. A large stone table sat at the center, with many chairs surrounding it, all of which were heavily damaged. However, the throne at the head of the table was pristine, and seemed to be designed much more intricately than the other chairs. Sitting on the throne was a pale woman, who stared at us inquisitively. She was of a large build, but so thin that her bones were visible, her skin tightly wrapping around her skeletal frame. Her skin was a bizarre shade of white, and seemed quite like porcelain. Her lips were stained black, and her veins were a similar color, like blackened cracks running along her porcelain form. Her left eye was a piercing shade of green. Her right eye was a mass of scar tissue that ran down her cheek, almost touching her mouth. Furthermore, her facial bones on this side seemed to have eroded away, leaving a large dent in the side of her head. A long mass of well-kept black hair rolled down her shoulders. Resting on her brow was a stone crown, with a white gem in the center. Rather than the elegant gown which I might have expected such a dignified woman to wear, her body bore no clothing. Instead, she was caked in thick, flowing ash from the neck down. The pillar looked as if it would also serve as armor, but in any event... 3, 2, 1. The pillar looked as if it would also serve as armor, but in any event, the statement of this dress was clear. This woman was not to be trifled with. She stood up and walked over to us. A grin spread across her face, betraying the sick, sadistic happiness of a cat toying with a mouse before delivering the fatal blow. I am Lorgani, ruler of Sychnir, and last surviving divinity. You are clearly not of this world, and have traveled far to hold counsel with me. What have you come to say? I hesitated. I was so sure of myself in Willis's mansion, even in the face of terrifying warriors far more skilled than Ben or I. But something about this woman shook me to my very core, as if I was in the presence of an actual goddess. Her eye fell upon mine, and I nudged Ben forward, hoping that he would take the lead. He began to stammer, then caught himself. We come from the other side. We aren't sure why you've invaded our world, but we have come to end any further threat. Would negotiation be possible? I admired Ben's strength of will against this dark spectre. It was more than I could even feign at the moment. However, at the mention of negotiation, she let out a deep, guttural laugh. Invade?
you would consider a handful of scouts an invasion force. You really are pathetic. This will be easier than I thought. As for negotiations, I think not. If we were to negotiate, what reason would I have to honor any terms? I am powerful beyond your darkest nightmares. Yet, I am quite merciful, as befits a divinity. You may join me as my personal slaves. It would be quite fun to keep a pet from your world. Or, if that doesn't suit you, you may leave this place and run as far away as your frail little bodies can carry you. If you please, you can run all the way back to your precious home and wait for my coming. Make your choice soon, though. The last man who tried my patience was thrown over the side of this peak in several pieces. I gasped, then snapped out, I'll join you. You're clearly beyond anything that Earth has to offer, and I'll have a better life at your side than running from you. Farewell, my friends. May you live a peaceful life, however far you must run to achieve this. Lorgani laughed again, as I bowed my head and walked over to her, standing just beside her. Mr. Smythe, Ben muttered dejectedly. I could draw my sword and stab her now. No, I could not take the risk of betraying her upon our first meeting. If she turned around, if I missed a vital organ, if I pierced her heart and she still somehow didn't fall, the punishment would be quite severe. If a man is cut into pieces and thrown off a mountain for simply trying her patience, I would surely regret a failed betrayal. Instead, I flashed Ben a subtle wink, which he seemed to take notice of. Clara began to speak, a defiant growl in her voice. Listen here now, I don't care who or what you are. I suffered many years, fighting daily just so that I could eat. These two offered me a better life, one of plentiful food and drink, and I won't stop until I have it. I've hunted your warriors for as long as I can remember, and I've refined my techniques so thoroughly that they don't even pose a threat to me. If you stand in my way, then I'll just cut a path right through you. Ben opened his mouth, but Clara flashed him a quick glare which silenced him. Lorgani began to pace about in front of me. The ash of the throne room began to swirl under our feet, spiraling toward her. It rose from the ground, forming a sword in her hand. She flourished the blade, then looked to Clara. So, another blasphemer. Surely you don't believe that you could stand against a divinity? Ah, but either way, such insolence cannot go unpunished. Clara growled and leapt at her, knives glinting. Lorgani tripped her, and as she fell, a cloud of ash burst up into her face. Lorgani flew at Ben, who tried to back away. She picked him up by his throat and carried him over to the long stairs leading down. With a soft grunt, she threw him over the edge. He rolled down at an alarming speed, reaching the fork in the mountain road very quickly. He started to crawl away, but warriors flew out from the underground chamber, cutting him off almost. 3, 2, 1. He began to crawl away, but warriors flooded out of the underground chamber, cutting off his escape almost instantly. She now turned back to Clara, smiling even more widely. As Clara stood back up, Lorgani jumped high into the air. Lightning came down from the sky, striking Lorgani's hand. I watched as she pirouetted in midair, hurling the bolt down onto Clara as she fell. The bolt hit Clara squarely in the back and knocked her to the ground. Clara groaned in pain, then stopped moving. I walked over to her, holding my hand to her face. She's still alive, I uttered, more out of shock than anything else. The guards will tend to her, Morgani called, for I have something special for people like her. It's what I would have done to you, should you have taken my offer only to betray me. But now is not the time for such things. Let us rest, and perhaps you could tell me more of your earth. I shuddered in fear, but knew that I would have to play along with this charade if I would ever see my home again.
Ben. I stirred, reluctant to move. My entire body ached from the fall, and I doubted that I could even stand. The sickly sweet taste and smell of my blood only enhanced the weakness I felt in my torn muscles and shaken bones. Perhaps I should just wait here, and keep acting like I was still unconscious. A sharp kick hit my chest, and I rolled over. A soldier stood above me, poised to strike. He motioned toward a group of people, all dressed in rags. A group of soldiers gathered around them. I stood up, my legs weak and tired. I slowly walked over to them, and the soldier watching me fell into line. We began to march. I looked around and saw that we were already outside the city. One of the prisoners came up to me, an old man. He wore a circlet of rolled cloth on his head. He was appallingly haggard, and his face held no expression in its many wrinkles, yet his eyes betrayed an intense ferocity.
So, new blood, what's your name? He choked out.
His voice was scratchy, as if he had inhaled too much of the ash.
I'm Ben,
I whispered, scared of what the man might do. He glared at me for a second, then laughed.
Well. A little nervous, are we? Good. You should be afraid, outsider. Our divinity has been keeping this lot out in the desert for a while now. No food and no shelter. They would have rebelled already, but she's kept us well guarded. I don't know what she's got planned for us, but you would do well to keep your guard up.
He walked away, and my heart sank as his words echoed in my ears.
Daniel, the interrogation was long and intense. Lorgani had wanted to know everything about my world, down to former presidents and sports records. I told her everything I knew. I had sensed that she would be able to see through any lies or embellishments. She was quite entertained to learn that I was just a petty swindler. How about that? All that poise and dignity, and it turns out you're just a petty thug. Well, appearances certainly are deceiving. Don't worry, darling. You've chosen to submit to me, so I'll take care of you now. You won't have to do anything so vulgar again, as long as you remain at my side.
I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded. It didn't make much sense to think of my long-term goals with someone I would eventually kill. Yet, she seemed to find my presence endearing. Lorgani acted tough, but as long as I let her think she was controlling me, she clearly enjoyed my company. It interested me that someone so uncanny and inhumane would fall victim to the same loneliness as the humans she studied. Such things are exploitable, after all. Ben. Marching, nothing but marching until our legs gave out. I could barely stand with my wounds, yet those fiends made us march far out into the desert. The old man seemed to have given up hope, and I wasn't far behind.
Daniel. Lorgani led us, along with a small battalion, into the wasteland. We reached a large pit, with a small terrace watching over it. Another battalion arrived, marching a group of rugged prisoners in tattered robes. They were forced to slide into the soft pit.
The other battalion dropped their spears into the pit. The prisoners quickly armed themselves, and Lorgani led me over to the terrace, chuckling. The battalion followed us, dragging something alongside them. Lorgani waved, and they came forward, dragging Clara. She was bound, and wearing a similar robe to the prisoners. The back of her robe was soaked in blood, and cuts on her neck and shoulders were apparent. It looked as if she had been flogged, or slowly cut by many small blades. I gasped, and Lorgani placed a hand on my shoulder. "Oh, my darling pet, is your friendship starting to cloud your judgment?" My heart sank as I realized what was happening. This was to be a test of my loyalty. "No," I replied. I leaned casually on my cane, struggling to keep my composure. For what is friendship in the face of a divinity? Any kinship between us is gone. Like a guiding light, your radiance outshines anything I have ever seen. She smirked and picked up Clara, who was tiredly struggling against her bonds. Lorgani flashed out a blade and sliced through them, then threw her into a pit below. 3, 2, 1. Lorgani flashed out a blade and sliced through them, then threw her into the pit below. Lorgani shouted to the prisoners, "I've been starving you dogs for a long time now." 3, 2, 1. "I've been starving you vermin for a long time now, but I was feeling generous today. This pest tried to attack me, and in my very own throne room. Tear her apart and leave nothing left to bury." I stifled a gasp. To think that she could be so brutal. The prisoners were uneasy. They shifted about nervously, and none of them dared to approach her. A man stepped out from the crowd, hobbling on a spear. His face was coated with ash, but I still recognized him. I grew sick as Ben drew closer. "Clara." Lorgani's command stood. I was to be executed by whatever means, and Ben was to be the executioner. I looked over at Daniel, and though his face was stoic, I could see the pain in his eyes. Ben strode over to me. He readied his staff. I flinched, but he held it out as if to give it to me. "When we first met, I didn't trust you. I still wouldn't if I had a choice. Just take it, and don't make me regret this." I was elated. I took the staff from him and replied, "Get behind me. I'll keep us safe one way or another." The prisoners didn't seem interested and huddled up. They began to chant. It was slow and soft, but grew into a roar. "Aragus, Aragus, Aragus." The crowd parted, and an old man came forth. He held a spear in one hand and a short sword in the other. I realized that the spear was the same variety wielded by the assassins lining the city. He leaned on the spear, as if he were unable to stand without it. He walked up to me, and I began to feel as if he was holding back, as if he wanted to kill me but kept himself from doing so. He swept at me with the spear. I caught it with the tip of my staff, and he pressed himself close to me. He did not bring his sword around, though. Instead, he began to speak. "You've begun too early, but I can still get us out of here. We just need to buy some time, so let's put on a show." He pushed my staff away and backed off. I wondered momentarily what he was planning, but there was no time. I sprung into action, bringing the blade of my staff around to face him. I stabbed at him, but he deflected the blow with his spear.
I barely had time to bring up the handle of my staff to meet a flurry of blows from his sword. He spun around, as if he were dancing. His spear tip flicked about and cut my face. I gasped in shock, then reacted. I forced the tip of my staff into the ground and used the momentum to flip myself and the weapon over him. I followed with a sweep at his legs that seemed to catch him off guard. He fell, but rolled out of my next strike. He dropped his weapons and pulled my leg out from under me. As I fell, he picked up his spear and raised it above his head.
"Now, my brethren,"
His cry rang out across the plains, and the ash seemed to rally to it. The rim of the pit bustled with life as the grey-robed assassins stood up. Lorgani gasped, and Daniel drew his sword, but Lorgani motioned something to him, and he put it away. Aragus slammed his weapon into the ground next to my head and sprung off of it up to Lorgani's platform. Lorgani wrapped herself around Daniel, and the platform exploded. The column of ash reached up, shooting them into the air. Aragus fell back into the pit and coughed violently as he stood up. The legionnaires scrambled to defend themselves, but the assassins had already cut most of them down. Without Lorgani, they had fallen into disarray and were easily finished. Aragus ran over to us. "We failed to kill Lorgani, but we still dealt quite a blow. Many legionnaires are out of service, and we gave her new friend a little scare." "Who was he, anyway?"
"He's with us,"
Ben stated.
"and it would seem he's fooled her into letting him cozy up to her. However, he isn't nearly as friendly to her as he's letting on, and I do believe that his position is just what your lot needs. We just have to give him an opportunity to strike. You got any ideas about how?"
Aragus smiled.
"Of course I do.
"But first, let us resupply. I'd rather not fight her in these rags. My brethren, who form the resistance, have a little hideout in the ashen wastes. We can resupply there."
It was settled. Daniel. We flew through the air. Lorgani wrapped around my torso. I was terrified and nearly vomited when we began to fall. Lorgani seemed unfazed, however, and only held me more tightly. I noticed that we were flying toward the throne room. The ash blanketing the place began to stir, and soon we were being pelted with little particles. The ash cleared from the throne room, rising in a great cloud to slow our descent. We landed relatively softly, and Lorgani set me down on her throne.
"So they freed the old man," she began, pacing about as the ash settled. "We have to speed this along, or we are unraveled. Our plans must be brought to fruition. But I am not quite strong enough. Not anymore. I need more power." "No, that makes no sense. Foolish, foolish, foolish. I must be growing too hasty. Ah, it would seem that I must call upon your loyalty, pet. Would you be willing to become like me and wield my power in my name?"
I was shocked. That she would trust me with such a thing as she had demonstrated was proof that she didn't suspect a thing. My plan was going off without a hitch, and I could soon strike her down. I just needed for her to be truly distracted. I could not risk a half-hearted stab at her back when she turned, nor could I wait for her to sleep. I had to make sure that I struck true, because I would not get a second chance. I snapped back to awareness and replied, "It would be an honor to host your strength, but how could I possibly become so great as you?" She laughed. "My darling, to achieve apotheosis, you must simply abandon your humanity." A chill ran down my spine, but before I could react, she had taken hold of my wrist. She formed a small blade in her other hand and drew it across my arm. I screamed and bled profusely. She had a look of overwhelming pleasure on her face, as if watching filth being purged from my body. I began to feel strange and slumped over. I saw her run the blade down her own wrist, and she held it to my wound. Her thick, black blood shot into my veins, reinvigorating me. I felt delirious, as if the blood had some intoxicating effect. Yet I somehow knew I was stronger than ever before. I had transcended humanity, and now my place on the scientific chart was likely closer to the denizens of Sai-Kanir. She pulled me off the throne. Good, you can stand. I wasn't quite sure how much that would unbalance you, or if you'd even survive, as I've only ever theorized about blessing someone in such a manner. Can you feel it, darling? You are so much more now. There's no time to spare. I have given you a powerful weapon, but you must first learn how to wield it. First, we will practice some basic ash manipulation. Simply extend your will to include the ash as well as your own body. I was amazed, but did as she asked. I tried to focus, but I couldn't. I began to doubt myself, and whether or not I could fulfill my true goal. I still felt anemic, and her oily blood hadn't fully run its course. Lorgani growled and slapped me with overwhelming force. I fell over, then pulled myself to my knees. The hard impact of her foot on my back sprawled me out forcefully. I tried to get back up, but before I could even think, I had been hoisted aloft by my clothes. I looked up, and her eye pierced my very soul as she began to speak. You won't survive my world if you can't use the ash beneath your feet. At the end of the day, it's my only true ally, and unless you embrace that same mentality, you're going to die out here. Now be a good, darling little pet and kiss the ash for me. It might just fall in love with you if you would just try a little harder. She slammed me back down, pushing my face into the ground. My doubt was beginning to subside, replaced by a burning anger. I took a deep breath and willed the ash to rise with all of my mental fortitude. The ashen ground stirred, and small pillars began to rise. Shock took over my mind, and the ash fell once more. Organi gasped, then moved over to me. Excellent work, darling. I'm quite proud, of course. That was rather feeble, though, so you'll still need to train quite a lot. I'll whip you into shape, literally if I must. You will be a perfect vessel for my power. When we have conquered your earth, I will teach you the full extent of the strength you now bear. Only then, all right. I can't have you thinking you're my equal and betraying me at the last moment. I opened my mouth to speak, then thought otherwise. Perhaps it would be better to serve her. I would have a much better life, and never have to worry about stealing ever again. My new home would be rather nice, and Morgani would go back to a peaceful state. Well, perhaps not that last part. But with this power at our disposal, would it even matter? Ben. Our goose led us out into the desert, almost out of view of the city. We approached a hill which had a few holes in the top, as if some sort of insects were nested there. Suddenly he grabbed us and pulled us both under his cloak. Stay still, he whispered, and we sat there for a moment as something approached, then left. What was that? I asked, dreading some sort of primordial beast. Legion Patrol. She's grown more paranoid as the years go on, and rightfully so. We've been picking away at her forces from just outside their doorstep. We had an ambush set up at that pit, but we didn't account for your presence at that meeting. However, your friend fought quite well, and I've decided to let you in on our little operation. He stood up and looked around, then called softly. The rest of the procession stood up and followed us as Aragus led us closer to the hill. The gray plants grew more thickly around that hill, and soon our view was almost entirely obscured. We came upon a hole in the side of the hill, and followed the tunnel inward. The hole opened up into a large cavern, illuminated by the holes in the roof, as lightning flashed above. Aragus led us to his armory, and we donned the gray cloaks and armor of his assassins. I had no idea how to fight with these bizarre weapons, so I resolved to simply blend in. Hopefully I could still keep up an act of professionalism to hide this. I drank with a few of the men to put my mind at ease, but I couldn't hold more than one tiny stone bottle's worth of fluid. Whatever they were drinking, it was way too strong for me. As I walked to the small room where Aragus told us we'd be sleeping, Clara approached me.
Ben,
She began, bowing her head.
you do actually trust Daniel, right? You didn't just say that so they wouldn't leave us, did you?
She looked up, and I saw tears form in her eyes. I knew I had to say something, but I couldn't find the words. Whatever was on her mind, I was clearly the last person she should look to for comfort. I inhaled deeply and rested my hand on her shoulder. Mr. Smythe and I met at a bar. I was drinking myself silly, knowing that I'd be too poor to pay for a single drop. The bartender was catching on, and he was about to throw me out when he stepped in. He paid my tab for the night, and asked why I was partaking in such a nasty habit. But you see, I wasn't able to afford a home. I slept on the streets, and the only thing to keep me warm at night was a strong drink. He offered me a chance to get rich, told me about some dead man with a fancy house, and our failed heist is how we met you. The point is, Mr. Smythe would never turn against me. He's my friend, and he'd never hurt me. And judging by the way he talked to you, he'd never hurt you either. He's a proper gentleman, and wouldn't hurt anything that didn't attack him first. Clara wiped the tears from her eyes, which quickly welled back up.
But are you sure? She sobbed. Are you sure that he'll keep his end of the bargain? Life in your world sounds so precious. I long to live that way, where not every day is a struggle for survival. Now that I know I can, my life in the cave seems like a living hell in retrospect. I need to know that my struggle to improve my life is not for nothing.
Now I had proof. I thought that she was complex, just like Mr. Smythe, but now I knew that she was just as simple as me. I should have known all along that distrusting her was silly, but I wanted to show Mr. Smythe that I really wasn't stupid. Now I'd proven myself the fool once again. There was only one way to remedy the situation now, and that was to give Clara my absolute trust. Clara, I'm sorry. I may have misled you just then. Mr. Smythe may look the part, but he's a ruffian at heart, and he may actually betray us. I have faith that he won't, but my instincts have never been a reliable guide. However, I can still bring you back with me. There's a great deal of wealth that only Mr. Smythe and I know about. I might not be able to show you as much beauty in our world as Mr. Smythe would, but I can keep you safe. I owe you my life, and I will do my best to repay that debt in full." Clara choked back another sob, then curled her lips into a thin smile.
"Thank you."
She turned and walked toward the sleeping quarters.
"Clara." I woke to a loud commotion. The assassins were all sitting about the living quarters talking amongst themselves. Aragus shouted from in the main room.
"Come in here, it's time."
I jumped up and walked inside. Aragus was bent over a makeshift map, which he had drawn out on the floor.
"I've found out much in the past few days, and I've devised a plan to kill Lorgani and free us all. Our new friends, Ben and Clara, have come from the other dimension, this land of Earth. Lorgani has had her mind set on otherworldly conquest for some time now, ever since discovering the existence of their world. Furthermore, she has completed certain research into these rifts, and found a way to weaponize it. As of now, she could artificially create a rift large enough to ram the entire Legion through at once and take Earth by storm. From what Ben told me, they would stand no chance. Still, there is hope for both worlds. The latest patrol of scouts have found where she's planning to open this rift. On the mountainside opposite the city lies a small valley. This valley seemed empty, but we saw a patrol of legionnaires driving a small group of slaves into the valley. Upon further investigation, we discovered that they were building a strange pedestal with a receptacle on top. I now have no doubt that this is where Lorgani intends to open this rift. Now we have the upper hand. If we can get there first, we can set a trap for her. However, we would need to wait until she tries to open the rift before we would be able to strike, for our ambush to have maximum effect. We would need to lie far enough away to where she couldn't recognize our gray cloaks, and that would take being out of earshot. I do remember the rifts having some connection to the lightning that dances through our sky, and she will likely call upon this at some point. That will be our cue. It is certain that she will have mustered all her strength there, so I've commissioned the use of medicinal Zythor. For those of us who are not native to this place, it is our only medicine. You've already tasted the food variant, that bitter tea we distill from the great plants that dot our landscape. It's weak, but there is a second method. If we refine it heavily, it produces a potent catalyst for the regrowth of flesh. It takes a lot of effort, and it's quite costly to produce, so we almost never use it. Today, however, we must employ every weapon at our disposal. Hold nothing back. Any questions?
Everyone was silent.
Well then, he continued, let us depart. Daniel. Lorgani led me up to a stone pedestal. The entire legion had marched here with us. They obediently waited for their mistress. She reached up and plucked the gem from her diadem, then placed it atop the pedestal. The gem somehow commanded my attention, and I began to hear a soft whine coming from it. Lorgani turned to her soldiers and began to speak.
It was countless millennia ago that the Great War scorched our lands and made them barren. Before, Sykenir was a verdant place, and now all that remains is us. We hid in the darkness underground, so that the endless fires and storms would not take us with the rest of the world. When the flames died, we rose from the ashes and carved our home into this mountain. None are alive to remember those days now, and only myths passed from divinity to divinity remain. It is my sacred duty and my pleasure to keep us from being forced underground again. Still, we languish. We are fed nothing except the root drink Zythor, and we breathe nothing but the ash which chokes us. It should be quite clear to each and every one of you that this cannot continue. We've come so far, but our lives are little more than a constant fight for survival in this shattered place. This is why I've gathered you here. Paradise is nearly our reality. We have found a path to a new world, one of bountiful pastures and clean skies. The people there are small and weak, relying on their tools to keep their society alive. They are no match for us. We who forged ourselves to be as severe as the world we were born in. We are born of ashes, made strong by ashes, and if we are undone, we shall only be undone by that very ash. Now we strike. My legion stands ready to fight for their very existence. We shall claim this new land as our own, for as the superior species, it is our birthright to dominate. We will seize this paradise and begin anew. After all, there is no other path for us to take. I place my faith in you, honorable warriors of Syconier. Do what you must.
Divinity was an apt title for this woman. Her words shook the crowd like gospel, and the woman herself was positively radiant. Her charisma was undeniable, and despite her cruelty upon our first meeting, I could feel that her heart was pure. Lorgani lowered her voice and turned to me. Her eyes stared lovingly into mine.
You, darling, have yet to truly prove yourself. I hope that you won't disappoint me after all of the time I spent on you.
Another test of my resolve. Humans are weak and stupid.
I see this now through your gift of blood. They do not deserve their luxuries when they have earned none of them. This is a simple matter of stealing what rightfully belongs to us, something I am well acquainted with. My indignance seemed to satisfy her. She turned back to the gem. Stand back. You shall be the first to witness my cleansing light in many an era. Let the essence of the sky open the gate to paradise.
I moved aside, and she became silent. The storm intensified overhead. Lightning bolts violently struck at the gem, and it began to glow. Suddenly, Lorgani paused and looked to the mountain. A single figure stood on the cliff. It was one of the assassins in their signature gray cloak. He raised his spear and let out a war cry, which echoed down the hill. 20, maybe 30 more stood up around him, picking up spears and swords. They cried in anticipation, then stopped. The leader began to run at us. This madman was actually running down a mountain at us. For whatever reason, the others followed closely behind him. Some staggered and fell, but not enough to make any real difference. "Close ranks! Form a defensive line!" The words had escaped my mouth before I could think. Lorgani looked down at me. I bowed my head. Well, darling, perhaps I shall have some use for you after all. Do as he says. Get to it. The Legion formed a phalanx between us, but the assassins still pressed their attack. They grew even closer now, and seemed unfaltering in their goal. Still, these were clearly survivors, and they wouldn't be foolish enough for a suicidal charge. They began to split, and I saw their true motive. They would rush around the line and attack Lorgani. And me. She seemed to understand this and spoke up. "Fall back! Protect your divinity!" They snapped into action and retreated, but the assassins were now almost upon us, reforming into a wedge. Their spears glinted in the dim light, and their eyes shone with cold vengeance. They sped up, rushing the line. The assassins leapt at us, their spiked boots flashing wickedly. The legion struck out and hit some, but they turned away the blows. Their cloaks tore away to reveal thick stone pauldrons and gauntlets concealed underneath. The legion was losing soldiers quickly, but held fast. Lorgani hurled great spikes of ash down at the assassins. The legion was picking them apart slowly. We were losing soldiers too quickly, though. I drew my sword from my cane and pulled a chunk of ash into my hand, sharpening it into something resembling a throwing knife. I picked out a target and raised my arm to throw, but stopped. I looked at my target's face as they stood in the back, waiting to strike. It was Clara. So they were among these gray ranks. I would have to be careful. I paused again, considering Lorgani's offer. Was Ben so important that I should put him above myself? Was Clara? No, I wouldn't let them stand in my way. If I let them die here, I could live on, as a prince, or perhaps a god. Why would I stand in Lorgani's way of making this dream come true? As I had done with Clara, she was offering me a better life. The key difference was that, while all I could offer was the basic dignity of any man, Lorgani offered paradise to me and her people alike. Truly, she was a good person and an excellent ruler. I drew my arm back again and let the knife fly. It embedded itself in Clara's shoulder. Her screams were like a symphony heralding my ascension. I looked down at the field below. The legion fought valiantly, cutting down the traitors to her divine grace. Surely they loved her, for they gave their lives so readily to protect her. Her strength was proven. She let even more of her power show now, as she had forsaken the ash, and was now leaping up and down, calling forth bolts of lightning in her entrancing aerial dance. A bead of sweat began to form on her eyebrow. I realized that she was desperate now, and strained herself to fend off these attackers. I had to help her. I scooped up a large clump of ash in my hand and leapt into the fray. I threw it into the face of an assassin, then plunged my blade into him. Another came close, and swept at me with his spear. I ducked below, and a bolt of lightning struck him as his swing flew overhead. Even now Lorgani protected me. I looked back at her and smiled. She waved gracefully, then resumed her assault. I turned back, and saw the old man from the pit leaping at me. He brought his spear around in a wide arc, and I tried to step back, but the spike on the side caught my chest. I felt the spike break my skin, but it didn't go deep. I realized that the stolen wallet in my pocket must have cushioned the blow and given me a second chance. Reaching downward, I focused my will, allowing all my hatred for these blasphemous traitors to flow into the ash. How could they dare to attack Lorgani? Don't they see that she's the best thing for all of us? My faith, my ambition was absolute. No other thoughts coursed through my mind. Salvation is at hand. As my hands met the ground, the ashen battlefield exploded into a massive cloud. The old man was flung away, and nothing else came through the ash. Was the battle over? No, not yet. Ben and Clara called through the smoke. I bit back a reply and willed myself to ignore them. Lorgani crooned a soft, eerie tune in reply. She walked into view, a sword forming in her hand. Ben and Clara still called, and Lorgani remained stoic, strolling through the cloud. The ash was settling now, and they came into view. I pulled myself up and began to follow them. Ben and Clara stopped, staring at Lorgani, who now silently ran her fingers along her blade as if to taunt them. Clara rushed forward, stone knives glinting as she charged. She attacked with a long flurry of blows, but Lorgani was unfazed, deflecting each strike with apparent ease. She lunged forward, bowling over the smaller Clara. Lorgani followed by slamming her sword into Clara's belly. She screamed in pain, then fell over. As Clara bled out, I saw her reach for a small flask, but remained silent. Lorgani took no notice of this, and focused instead on Ben, who was backing up quite rapidly. I drew the black knife, and followed a bit more closely, ignoring the wounded Clara as I passed. Ben poked at Lorgani with his spear, but she sidestepped the thrust and caught the handle as she passed, ripping the weapon away from him. She slashed at his foot and cut deep. He fell over, crying in pain. He tried to scramble back, but forced himself against a large rock. He looked over to me, and as his gaze caught mine, I wished that I could disappear back into the ash. "Mr. Smythe," he called, and I looked away, cursing under my breath. As tears formed in his eyes, Lorgani raised her blade to strike. As she did, I felt possessed, as if by some external will. Dagger in hand, I rushed up behind Lorgani, and felt my lofty dreams burn away into ash as I plunged the knife into her heart. She gasped, then turned around. The knife dislodged from her chest, and I held it loosely, my arms limp. She stumbled forward, catching herself on my shoulder. Her eye burned with the fury of 1,000 dying suns, but her face retained a sense of serene beauty. She coughed, and blood ran down her chin. "I thought you were smarter than that, boy. You could have become a god," she continued, but her mouth didn't move. I could hear her voice inside my head. "Don't you see that I am what holds this world together? I am Lorgani. I am the divinity of Psychneer. Is your selfishness not absolute? At least I now know the true nature of you." She fell over, dead. I screamed in desperation. "What have you done? Answer me!" But no answer came. She was dead. Even her ashen shell had fallen away. As I looked closer, I saw that the knife wound had begun to dissolve her flesh, as if the blade possessed some sort of necrotic quality. Ben screamed as he watched her flesh and bones melt away, leaving nothing but the diadem soaking in a small puddle of fluid and a vile smell that overpowered even the pungent ash. The old man walked over. "Fine work, friend," he began. "For many years we tried to overthrow her. She's taken so many precautions that our stunt at the pit was the closest we've gotten in a long time. And you've managed to accomplish what Psychoneer's finest soldiers couldn't. But surely she wouldn't let you in that deep without some precautions. Did she do anything particularly strange to you, boy? My name is Daniel Smythe. Where's Clara? I pressed, looking around for her. A hand tapped my shoulder. I turned around to see her, relatively unharmed. The rip in her clothes where she had been pierced now showed only a grand scar caked in dried blood. A little psychoneran medicine, the old man resumed, evident pride in his voice. It's very hard to make, and incredibly rare. Even so, it can forestall an otherwise fatal wound if you're quick with it. Your friend will live. Not only that, but she told me everything I need to know about you. Now answer my question. Did she try anything? I thought for a moment, then realized the implications. I wondered what the man might do if he knew. No, I choked out. Not that I can recall. Why? The old man looked suspicious, but continued. The divinity has this sort of power over those who share her blood. Usually this simply increases her natural charisma when addressing her subjects. However, the closer the blood ties, the more influence she can exert. I barely kept myself and my personal squadron from being swayed through rigorous mental training. You're obviously not psychoneran, so you should be safe from her mental subjugation. However, I can't help but wonder, why would she let you so close to her? I suppose it's no problem now. She's dead, and that's all that I need to restore some semblance of order around here. I shuddered. I had felt such righteousness in Morgani's cause. I had ignored Ben and Clara, not caring for their very survival. Was it possible that Lorgani's influence was what brought this on? A burst of clarity hit me. For the past day or so, my thoughts were not my own. Somehow she had gotten into my mind and altered my nature. Now that I couldn't feel her anymore, I had returned to my true self. A chill ran down my spine, and my mind filled with dreadful thoughts of what could have happened were she still alive. I looked down at the puddle again, reaffirming myself as the foul liquid soaked into the ground. We'll need to be going, I mumbled. Thank you for your concern. Should any issues arrive, send a messenger through the rift. Good luck convincing them to let you on that throne. He laughed. I am Aragus. I led the finest band of warriors ever known. I am a hero to the people, and the closest thing that they have to a divinity of old. I will have no problem taking back our city. Now that the tyrant's gone, I can focus on civil matters. Farewell, Ben and Clara. I hope that we can meet again, under friendlier circumstances. As do I. Clara stepped in. Now, I do believe it's time we got back to what's important. After all, we still have an arrangement to fulfill. Daniel Smythe, you promised me that you would bring me food and water. I smiled warmly. Clara, my friend, I declared, you've earned all that I promised you and more. In fact, I would like to formally invite you to live with Ben and I. We've got ourselves a pretty nice setup above ground. She nodded, smiling as tears ran down her face. Very well, I began. Although, I have much to teach you about my world. Civilized society wouldn't think too highly of a cannibalistic cave dweller. It'll be an arduous task, but for you, I'm willing to see it through. Clara wiped the tears from her eyes. Of course I'm willing to learn. Ben, if you're ready, I think we should go. I turned away from them and scooped up a handful of ash. It was a bit hard for me to control, but thinking of Lorgani allowed me to shape it into a ball. I slipped it into my pocket, thinking about the potential uses for such a substance. Turning back to my friends, I announced, "Let's go home." As we began the journey back to Earth, the vibrant colors of spring danced through my mind. Epilogue. Daniel. Carson Willis had seen the rift. I hated that we had shown another civilian the rift, but there was no other way to convince him to let us have the house. He was so overcome by the incomprehensible presence of the rift that he couldn't even bear to stay in the same room as it, prompting us to conclude our business upstairs in the parlor. "And these people, you're sure that they won't come through, kill someone else?" "For now," I began, "though any interlopers could unbalance this situation. That is why we must have this house. You can take anything you want from inside. I'll even give you the money that your father left for us, if that makes things better." He sighed. "I am a firm believer that there are some things which mankind should never know about. The folly of humans delving into the unknown will surely bring about our undoing some day. You've already seen the other side, and you're willing to stand guard against any threat involving this, so I'll let you have the house. Just give me whatever cash he left you. I'm sure it'll be enough of a profit." I placed my hand on his shoulder. "I'm so sorry it came to this, Mr. Willis. Here's the money," I spoke, trying to console him. I fumbled in my pocket for a moment, then withdrew $5,000. He took the cash, tears welling in his eyes. "Good day, sir," he cried, running out the front door. I walked up and closed it behind him. Laughing quietly, I tucked the other half of Willis's inheritance deeper into my coat.